it's a little bit about that, and more. Let's hear from Father William this morning.
First of all, let me get this thing on. I feel like a space cadet or something. It's on my head. That's good, nice. No pictures. So, well, thanks very much for the invitation. I can't think of a nicer way to spend a beautiful fall morning than being together with you. I want to start just saying a bit about, now, the topic is the decree of the Second Vatican Council on the Church's relation with other religions. So, in kind of Catholic talk, but I don't think it's just Catholic talk any longer, we distinguish between ecumenical and interreligious. Ecumenical has to do with the relationships and the differences between commonalities with other Christian traditions. Interreligious is about Christianity in relation to the other great religions of the world. Primarily, but not exclusively, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. Although even Hinduism is a kind of an inexact term for the religious traditions of India. But, and it's interesting because the document we are going to read also speaks about Jews, but interreligious doesn't really respond to the Christian-Jewish difference. And the reason for that is because Jewish people are so closely related to Christian. Our roots are in Judaism. That's where we come from. So, relationship with the Jewish people is under the heading of ecumenical more than interreligious, which is just a little kind of organizational distinction. Now, first of all, just a word about why I've been invited to speak to you about this. Maybe it goes sideways. Is it okay?
It's all good.
This might be better. I'm not a scholar of interreligious dialogue. I'm not a scholar. In fact, I never took a single course on world religions. I grew up, as did my sister Louise, on a farm near the town of Holdingford, Minnesota. Holdingford was a very Catholic town. It was a town of 500 people and had 2 Catholic churches. We like to say the German church and the Catholic church. But we were part of the Polish church. Okay? So, but that was not an unusual situation back in the days of national parishes. I mean, in Minneapolis, you would have different churches pretty much about a block away from one another, wouldn't you? One for the Italians, one for the Poles, one for the Irish. You know, so that was not an unusual situation. But I grew up not really knowing a single Protestant. There was also a Lutheran church in the town, but it was very small. When my mother had me take piano lessons, she took me to the Lutheran pastor's wife. So I did have that kind of contact, and I kind of admire my mother for doing that because, you know, Lutherans were, as you put it, Bob, you felt sorry for them. they weren't going to make it. You know? But and one of my childhood memories was we grew up on a farm, but I was in town and I was playing ball with some kids on the lawn next to the Lutheran church, and wouldn't you know, the ball went through the window of the Lutheran church. Now, that didn't bother me so much. What really bothered me and scared me was going into the Lutheran church to get the ball. I mean, you know, it was like, you were really putting your soul in jeopardy by entering that church. So that's the kind of atmosphere I grew up in. It wasn't so much anti as simply unaware that there were people who believed, worshipped, thought about ultimate matters in a way different from the way we think about them. I went to St. John's as a young kid. I went to prep school there, and that was a different environment. It was still very Catholic, but there was more of an open attitude there. I can't point to any specifics. But just because we began to become aware of a long history, of the fact that the world was made up of more than just Christians and Catholics, so there was that kind of openness that got me going. But I really still had very little to do with any other religions other than Catholic. When I was in the seminary, however, we would have a yearly dialogue with the seminarians from Luther Theological. So already then, in 1963, we were coming together to meet. But those were meetings that were very different in character from now. Each of us was out to prove that we were right. That's what was the point of those meetings. It wasn't to learn about another tradition, it was to figure out where they were wrong, so that we could pat ourselves on the back for being right. And nonetheless, there was real friendship. There was real friendship. I remember when I was ordained, one of the Lutheran seminarians gave me Luther's little catechism that he was given when he was confirmed in the Lutheran Church. I mean, that was a sign of the kind of bond and friendship that existed, even though we were sure the others were on the wrong path. We just didn't know. But again, when I was a seminarian, a book came out. It was a translation of a French book, and that book was called Christian Yoga, already in 1963. Already in 1963. And it was written by a Benedictine monk who discovered yoga as a way to deal with some serious physical problems, medical problems that he was having. But he also was speaking about yoga as a spiritual path. And when he was speaking about yoga as a way of bringing one's whole being, not only head, but body, heart, soul, into this a religious expression, put it that way. And so that shaped me, and I started to do yoga, but in a very, I would try practicing sitting in a lotus position and standing on my head and doing all of those things, being the tree, but it had very little religious implication for me, although I did recognize that he spoke about yoga postures as an aid to meditation practice, to this, stillness of the mind. But then it kind of faded away. I got involved in other things. My academic work was mainly in the area of Catholic liturgy and preaching. I did that at a Protestant seminary. I did that at Princeton Theological. So again, the ecumenical dimension was present there. And I came back to St. John's and started teaching. And then I became the rector of the seminary, and after about 2 years of that, I went to the abbot and said, I think I have a pretty good academic background for what I'm doing, but I don't have enough experience in pastoral ministry. And if I'm going to be rector of a seminary that is preparing people, priests mainly at that time, but we had lay people in the school as well, for pastoral ministry, I need to speak out of experience and not just some head knowledge. And I said, and if I could do that, well, then he said, well, I can send you to one of our parishes, and you can spend some time working in one of our parishes. And I said, well, that would be one way, but what I would like to do, if possible, is combine pastoral ministry with an intercultural experience. And I knew that the Maryknoll missionaries had a program called their associate program for priests and brothers, and they would support them for 5 years of ministry in a foreign country. And I said, that's what I would really like to do. And he gave me permission to do that. And when I got to Maryknoll, I said, they asked us to tell them about a preference we might have or where to go. They were pretty well all around the world. I said, I'd like to go to Brazil, because Brazil was at that point, and we're talking now 1984, okay? Brazil at that time was really the focal point for what is called liberation theology. And liberation theology is a theology that works for the human liberation of people. And so in Brazil, it was very much, and throughout Latin America, an understanding that one of the church's primary ministries and missions has to be to the world's poor. That just as Jesus came and preached the gospel of, freedom to the poor of his day, that's what the church today has to do. And I said, being in Brazil would give me not only an experience of that, but also prepare me, because a lot of academic work was being done on liberation theology at that time, which had its critics, people saying they're buying too much into a Marxist approach to societal change. And some were a little bit left in that sense. But on the whole, it was a church that was really taking seriously the fact that the church's relation to the poor cannot simply be one of charity. It has to be something that deals with the causes of the people's poverty. And one of the big lessons, it was just one of these things that comes to my mind that I learned there, is that in Brazil, at least at that time, maybe even to the present, they didn't talk so much about the poor, they talked about the impoverished. And that's a different approach. And I can still remember a woman in the village I lived in and worked in. She said to me one day, as we were going out to one of the little farming settlements outside the town for Mass and maybe some catechetical work, she said, "I have yet to meet a poor man who does not have calluses on his hands." And that was a very interesting way of putting it. And what she's saying, these are people who work. They work hard. They sacrifice their lives almost in their work, and yet they are not paid living wages. So something is wrong with the system. These are not lazy people, which is not to say there are no lazy people. There are. But the real problem of poverty is the way resources are allocated, and who gets paid a living wage, who doesn't. So the church was dealing with those kinds of issues. I spent 5 years there, fell in love with Brazil, have gone back frequently. Let me just tell you again one story. I tend to get sidetracked on stories, but in Brazil, at least in that little village I was in, people thought very seriously about the curse. They called it the praga. And that you could curse somebody and that would affect their lives. That would make their lives miserable. They'd get sick. So that was very strong. Well, there was one day in the town when a family was hosting a party for the baptism of their child. And people, it appears, that among the guests were people who brought not only a lot of alcohol to that party, but also drugs. There was a neighbor across the street from the house where the party was being held who went over and began dancing with the mother of the child. And it was kind of a dance, a forró as they called it. And some people got very angry, including the woman's husband, the father. And he and some of his friends chased him out of the house and then followed him to his house across the street and beat him to death with logs that were on the porch in front of that man's wife and his children. It was a horrible situation. So I heard about that and I went there to talk with the widow, and she was there with her mother-in-law. Okay. And they were asking me, now, why did this happen? And the mother-in-law said, well, it happened because the curse. And I said, what? She said, well, when, and I can't remember the man's name who was killed, when Jose was a little boy, we lived out in the country, we came into the village, and we met in the village his godmother with her son, who was about the age of my son. And the two kids started fighting, and his godmother cursed him. So that's why he was killed. And I said, no, it was the drugs. It was the alcohol. It wasn't the curse. But I went home and I was living in a small community with some Brazilian young men. And I said, what is all this about a curse? You know, that, I said, where I grew up, you never really talked about that. You know, it may have happened, I don't know, but I never heard of anybody cursing somebody else and then that person getting killed or whatever. And they said to me, well, you have to remember these are uneducated people, you know, they still believe in those old myths and traditions, but no, it doesn't happen any longer. But then they said, why do you ask? And I said, because the man's mother, the mother of the man who was killed yesterday, said that the reason he was killed was because his godmother cursed him. And they all said, oh, curse of a godmother? That works. Yeah. And then they said, the curse of a priest, the curse of a mother, and a curse of a godmother. Yeah, there's no way you're gonna, you know. So it was still very strong. Well, this is all prelude to another story in that village. A pastor in the late 1700s, when the town was founded, it was the center of Brazil's iron mines at the time, ran into some kind of opposition from the big people in the town. They buried him alive. Oh. But before he died, he said he put a curse on the baptismal font. And he said, from this baptismal font, no priest will ever come. And that, in that village, if any kid, young man said he wanted to go out to the seminary to be a priest, they'd say, don't bother. You know, the baptismal font is cursed. You're never going to make it. And then they tell stories about, you remember old Antonio? Well, he was in the seminary, and you know, he was ready to be ordained, and at the last minute he left. You know, and it just, everybody in town believed that. So in my last Easter vigil in that town, I just thought something has to be done here, you know, to get rid of that curse. You have the blessing of the baptismal font. I doused it with kerosene and threw a lighted match in it. And flames. And then I said, if a priest can curse the baptismal font, a priest can also take that curse away. Yeah. And I realized I was going to have to do something dramatic, or it just wouldn't work. Well, God willing, next year, the first priest baptized in that font will be ordained. And I will be there. God willing, yeah. So those are kinds of my experiences of Brazil. That it was a country I fell in love with, a place from which I learned the whole notion of the empobrecidos, the impoverished, not the poor. I mean, just a lot. I came back to St. John's, but I should say when I was first went to ask the abbot if I could do some pastoral ministry, he said parish. And then I said, yes, parish would be fine, but I'd also like to do it in an intercultural setting, another cultural setting. He said, well, I can send you to our mission, our priory in Japan. And I said, Father Abbot, Japan is the last place in the world I'd want to go to. You know? So that's how Brazil came about. But 2 years after I was back, so this would have been now 1994, 1993, another abbot called me in and said, I would like to send you to Japan. And I said, I can remember thinking to myself, yes, I really want to go. And my reasoning was probably something I read, I don't remember specifically where I got this, but somebody who said, the church of the 21st century has two main challenges, if you want to call it that. How to relate the gospel of Jesus to the poor of this world, and how to relate the gospel of Jesus to the great religious traditions of the East. And I said, you know, by the grace of God, I've had this experience of a church that has adopted a preferential option for the poor, that was the term they used, and now I'm being given a chance to be in a country where Christianity is 1/2 of 1%, or 1%, Catholics about 1/2 of 1%, but whose religious tradition is completely non-Christian. and this is my chance. So I went to Japan. My first day there, full day, I went to the Jesuit University. There was a priest by the name of William Johnston who had written a lot about the relationship of the Catholic faith to Zen Buddhism. I said, how do I find out, what Zen Buddhism is all about? And he directed me to a Zendo, meditation center, Buddhist meditation Zen center, that was very open to Westerners and people of other religious traditions. And I started the practice of Zazen, sitting meditation is what it's called. So it wasn't because of any kind of academic interest in Buddhism. I wanted more of an experience of what this is all about. And I said it was a Zen center that attracted many Westerners, but also Japanese. It was about half Japanese and half Catholic, Christian, Westerners. I don't know if any of them were, some of them may not have even been practicing Christians. But I can still remember my first question. I walked in as they were in the middle of it was Saturday morning. They had a session every Saturday morning for people to come together and sit. But I arrived there just as they were doing their walking meditation. You intersperse the sitting with getting up and walking. And so they were all walking around like this. They looked like zombies. My first impression. And then I go in and I start doing the sitting meditation. And then comes the time to do reverence to the Buddha. And they all fall down on their knees. You know that I would do it here, but I'm not going to get up. Fall down on your knees and put your forehead to the floor, and you lift your hands like this. And you do that 3 times. Okay? And I was there, so I did it too, but I'm thinking all the time, this is idolatry. I'm worshiping a false god. But it didn't take too long before I had my one-on-one meeting with the master. And what you did was exactly the same thing. You fell down on your knees 3 times, put your head on the floor, and raised your hands. And it became clear to me, I immediately interpreted those bows as the equivalent of our genuflection to the Blessed Sacrament. But it's not like that at all. It's just a sign of respect. It's a sign of respect and a sign of profound respect. And what they are doing is showing their respect for the Buddha, for his teaching. Buddha is not a god. Buddha is an enlightened person. That's what the word means, an enlightened person. Or we might say today, someone who's woke. But sees reality for what it is. So that was the beginning of my involvement with interreligious dialogue. I then heard, in Japan now, it's 1995, I heard about a meeting of Buddhist and Catholic monks that is going to take place at the monastery of Thomas Merton, Gethsemane in Kentucky. So I asked if I could be a participant there, and I was told, no, but you can come as an observer. So I was there in 1996 for this first major meeting of Catholics, mostly monks, and Buddhists to take place in the United States. It was a fantastic experience, and that led me to be invited to become a member of an organization known as Monastic Interreligious Dialogue. And then after a couple of years, I was made the secretary, the president, and in 2008, I was invited to be I guess you'd say the head of the international organization for monastic interreligious dialogue. So that's been my experience. So it's been mainly just an experiential contact with members of other religions. I still am by no means an expert in Buddhism, much less in Islam or Hinduism, but I've had the opportunity, because of my role with this international organization, to travel a lot, to meet a lot of people. My travels have taken me throughout Europe, of course, but Thailand, India, Vietnam, even twice in Iran, for these dialogues. And these dialogues, again, monastic interreligious dialogue is not so much concerned about getting into theological questions. It's an attempt to share and learn from one another's spiritual practices. How do you express your relationship with God? Or how, for a Buddhist, for instance, do you express a relationship with that which is ultimate, which they would hesitate to put a name on, okay? One more anecdote, because I'll give you an idea of what some of the learning that I came from there. I took part in a 7-day retreat in a Buddhist monastery in Japan with a master, Roshi, Harada Roshi is his name. And there, you know, in these, you basically spend 8 hours a day meditating, but you also have a chance to meet with the master for an individual one-on-one. Now, he spoke a little English, but he mainly relied on a translator, a Buddhist nun who was American. So I went in for my one-on-one meeting with him. And if you can visualize a Japanese Zen master, stern, you know, tough, that's the image they portray. Although when you had tea with him, he was, you know, just a wonderful person to be with. But in his role as the Roshi, the Zen master. So he spoke to me in English. And again, this is the Japanese style. Where is God? So I said, everywhere. No! And again, where is God? And at this point, I was unnerved. And I said, inside? No! Out! Okay. So, and I came back the next day. And now I wonder, what's this going to be like? And now he's much more gentle, should I say? He said, where is God? And without even thinking about it, I went, yes. Yes. Put aside your ideas about God, and you will find God. And set me off. Now, you know, that was a powerful moment. But it again gives you a sense of some of the things I've learned. You know, the Buddhist wants to go right into the real, you know, and not so much worry about what do we call it, where did it come from. There's a wonderful story about the Buddha, or that the Buddha himself told about a soldier who was shot with an arrow in a battle, and people are coming up and want to pull the arrow out. And he says, no, no, no. I want to know who shot that arrow. I want to know what it was made of. How was the head attached to the shaft? You know, and the Buddha says, well, he died. You know? And so the Buddha is saying, you know, go to the problem. You meet the heart of the problem. Don't worry so much about concepts, about ideas, about theologies. Deal with the problem. And for the Buddha, the problem was suffering. Why do we suffer? How are we released from suffering? Okay. So it's those kinds of experiences that, through, you know, this farm boy from Holyrood was privileged to have. And what it has done for me, it has not, I would say honestly, it has not in any way weakened my faith, my Christian commitment, my faith. It has deepened it, and it has broadened it by seeing how other people respond to some of the same issues and questions that we have. Okay? So, I was going to do this for a 10-minute introduction, and look where we are. Sorry. But I would, before we get into this document, the document of the Second Vatican Council on the relation of the Church with other great religious traditions, I would like to ask you for a little feedback. And I want you to know, we speak so much about interreligious dialogue. And dialogue immediately sounds like you're talking about theological issues and comparing positions and all the rest. And I just want to point out at the beginning that the title of this document is The Relation of the Church with Other Religious Traditions, or to Other Religious Traditions. And so I would wonder if anybody here would just be willing to share anything that you might have had in terms of contacts you have had with people, and I'm not talking about other Christian traditions, with people who are Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim. Have you met them? Do you have a personal relationship with any of them? And what has that been like? Yeah.
Yeah, my neighbor Dharma, he grew up in India.
Mm-hmm.
We have weekly happy hours and we get into some beautiful conversations.
Mm-hmm. And would call herself Hindu.
Yep, he's also a yogi.
Mm-hmm.
But just so open to hear my perspective of things and open to hear his perspective.
Okay.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Anybody else? People at work? Yes.
I had one candidate for RCIA about a dozen years ago who was native to Iran and was raised in the Zoroastrian tradition.
No. Mm-hmm.
And she was just so delighted to learn about the Christian faith and could see some of the ways that her Zoroastrian tradition, particularly about metaphor of light, was really fully expressed in the Catholic faith, and that was something that she really loved, including the story about Magi and all of that.
Right. Who probably were Zoroastrians
Probably so, yeah.
in the story.
Yeah.
That's what they're representing. Yeah. Yes.
This is more of a question. Where does indigenous people fit?
We're interreligious. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, I would have to say that monastic interreligious dialogue, this group that I'm involved with some individual exceptions, has not had a great deal of contact. We have a monk at St. John's who transferred to St. John's when the monastery in South Dakota closed, and that monastery, Blue Cloud, had a lot of involvement with the indigenous people, the Dakota, basically, I think. He plays Indian flutes, so he's very much, but he's very conscious of the necessity. And you probably know, I'm trying to think of his name right now, the Indian catechist who died in maybe 1920 or 1930, South Dakota, Black Elk. The cause for his canonization has been introduced in Rome. Yeah. Now, Black Elk is so important because when he became a Christian, he didn't give up his indigenous religiosity, if you want to put it that way. He tried to hold them together. Not to say that they were the same, but they were different. They were different ways of speaking about the great, I'm not even sure the terminology, spirit, yeah, and what we would call God. But he kept them separate but interconnected. So the other question, of course, that related to yours is what about all the tribal religions, especially in Africa? And that's becoming another development of interreligious dialogue. Not to simply dismiss this, that's pure paganism, that's idolatry, that's diabolic, but to say what wisdom, human wisdom about the ultimate meaning of life and the ultimate source of life can they offer? And they have a lot to offer. Certainly as we're becoming more ecologically conscious, their relationship to the earth, to nature. And we're beginning to see that we have a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn because we have so much emphasized a misunderstanding of the creation account, which has God giving dominion over the world, which many eco-theologians say is one of the causes of the environmental crisis that we're facing, because we have this idea, maybe not even consciously, that we are the masters and we can dominate rather than preserve them and learn from. Any other kind of, yes?
I had befriended a young, maybe 17 or 18-year-old Muslim girl, and we were friends for like maybe 2 years, and she has since gone her own way, but we were going to have a book club, just the two of us, on seeking Allah, finding Jesus. And it was going to be something where I would be learning what they were seeking, you know, and she would find and learn about Jesus. And I thought, you know, that would be a good, interesting thing to happen, but then, like I say, we went our separate ways.
Yeah. And you're probably aware, Jesus has a very prominent place in the Quran. Yeah. The Quran name for him is Isa. But much of the biblical stories and some of the apocryphal stories, you know, you've maybe heard the story about Jesus making birds out of mud and they flew away, which hasn't made it into any of our Gospels, but it's in the Quran. And they also have great devotion for Mary. Great devotion for Mary. Miriam. And, you know, most of us are simply not aware of that. You know. Jesus, yes, they don't regard him as divine, but he's a great prophet, and that is that is the highest thing you can say about a person. And he will come at the last judgment. You know, they believe in the virgin birth of Jesus. That Jesus' mother was a virgin. So there are, but different ways of looking at it, but that presence is there. So there are connections. Somebody once said, maybe it's just in passing, that we tend to compare the Quran to the Bible, but it would be better to compare the Quran to the Blessed Sacrament, because that's the role the Quran has for Muslims. The same reverence. This is the actual Word of God. And just as we would say the Blessed Sacrament is the real presence of Jesus. Okay? So Quran and Blessed Sacrament are parallel. Because our Bible is not so much the direct Word of God, it's witness to God on the part of people to whom God has been manifested. Anybody else want to just mention contact? What I would like to do now, we'll get now into the actual document. And you know, just remind me.